My next guest is taking a return trip here a few months ago. People loved him. He wrote this book. He came out with this book called Fraud, and it's how the left plans to steal the next election. Sure enough, they don't really have a message. I'm hearing this all over the place. They don't have a message. They're attacking the president, and they're going to have to steal. He is Eric Eggers. Eric Eggers is the research director at the Government Accountability Institute. Eric, thanks for joining us today for a return trip about the voter fraud and election fraud that the Democrats must employ to try to win because they have no message. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Greg. It's great to be here.
I want to start with the news, and it just seems to me I just see one story after another. Of course, they don't make a big deal out of it in the mainstream press because, there's no evidence of voter fraud, they say. Of course, your book, Fraud, says something a bit different. But there's a lot of stories coming out about voter fraud on the front side of the election. In 2016, it all came out, thank you, Jill Stein, it all came out on the backside of the election. Is that something that is a phenomenon? Why is that happening?
Well, it's a great question, Greg. I think what people are realizing is that you have to attack and address voter fraud on the front side of the election because the reality is, and I've got subsequent research from the last time we spoke that I can use to elaborate on this, but the reality is if you don't address it on the front side, it's virtually meaningless and it's not going to be flagged in a way that's going to be large enough to be able to sway an election. But I think what's happened is you got President Trump talking about it. Hopefully, I think my book and people like you and your great audience who've been aware of this issue for some time, they're paying attention. And so the story that happened in Texas not too long ago, where it was confirmed that members of the Texas Democratic Party were sending absentee ballot request forms or sending voter registration forms with the boxes already marked saying, yes, I'm a citizen. Yes, I'd like to register to vote. And they're sending them to non-citizens, sending them to dead people, right? So basically, that's helping serve up voter fraud on a platter. And the fact that the Texas Democratic Party was behind it, I think, is only confirmation of what you and your audience have known for a long time and what I write about in the book. There is an organized effort to exploit the vulnerabilities in our electoral system. And thankfully, people are taking it seriously and are paying attention on the front end because that's the only way to try to make elections as secure as possible.
This is a felony, is it not? Aren't these felonies we're talking about here?
It's absolutely a felony, and that's really the key, right? Some people, and I've spoken to legal officers, whether they're judges or prosecutors, they've been confronted with cases of voter fraud previously, but I think there's always been some hesitancy to address it and to prosecute it to the full weight because they say, well, is it really that big of a deal? And if I've got limited resources as a prosecutor or as a law enforcement entity, am I really that interested in using those resources to prosecute voter fraud when I could be going after maybe more physical assaults or what might be perceived to be larger crimes that aren't going to be perceived as political and might not alienate a certain percentage of my base? In the book, I talk about an instance where the sheriff's office in South Florida investigated and found hundreds of examples of documented, fraudulently filled out absentee ballot request forms, clear evidence of voter fraud, the newspapers wrote. But when they presented that information to a state attorney, he didn't do anything with it. And what we talk about in the book is because that state attorney would have to be, in a sense, prosecuting key political figures with reliable Democratic voting blocks. And these are voting blocks the state attorney was going to need if he was going to pursue a further career in political office. So there isn't much of an incentive structure for certain entities to pursue it criminally. So that's why I think it's so important that we flag it on the front end. I mean, what we're finding, right, is not necessarily people being charged, although that does happen sometimes, but people at least flag it and say, hey, this is wrong. And I think that's the first step. We've got to prevent the illegal ballots from being cast, and then we'll worry about the criminal charges later. At least that's my perspective.
A lot of people are worried about the machines. A lot of people don't want to vote early because they're afraid their vote's going to be messed with. Is there anything you can do when you're voting early or on the day of the election? I think it's November 6th. Is there anything you can do to try to ensure that your vote is not going to be tampered with?
So I'm less concerned about votes being tampered with in my research and the things I write about in the book. I didn't find much evidence of votes being changed, but of course that speaks to how would you know, right? I mean, what evidence would you actually be presented with that says, well, I voted for this, but then I think my vote ended up being cast another way. And it's because voting is basically an honor system. We have to trust that we have competent officials in charge of elections. What I'd be much more concerned about is my vote carrying the true weight of an honest vote, or is it being canceled out or watered down essentially by an illegal vote? And that's what I'd be worried about. And early voting is absolutely one way in which I think illegal votes get cast. In the book, I cite an affidavit of a poll watcher who saw somebody down in Miami go and cast a ballot during early voting for President Obama in 2012, and they appeared to be no more than 12 years old. And they were allowed to cast a ballot. You know, we have sworn legal documents to affirm that happened in the book. So I think early voting, any instance in which you've got masses of people, and I think you've got maybe less oversight than you might in other instances, is clearly a recipe for voter fraud. Absentee ballot is, of course, maybe the most famous, but I'd say that's followed by early voting.
Are they going to be out in force? ICE going to be out in force this year? I mean, have you heard anything of the things they're going to do? I know Donald Trump, this is a priority, but he also says that I'm not going to give people away, give my plans away when I'm going to do something. I don't say that. But is there a concerted effort to stop this, to reveal it? It just seems to me there's a whole lot more being revealed. Is there a concerted effort to reveal the voter fraud now, before the election?
Well, at the end of my book, I quote Christian Adams, who's been a very effective legal scholar and activist who's helped uncover actually quite a bit of the voter fraud that does occur in this country. And his quote was, the good news is we have a president who's laser focused on this topic. And I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, can you believe that we have a president who actually tweets warnings about voter fraud and says, look, we're watching, we're paying attention, and if you cheat, you will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. What a departure that is from really any other time in our nation's history. I mean, certainly the last 8 years under President Obama, who I think typified more of the perspective of, listen, voter fraud's not a real problem. Any effort to enforce voter fraud or increase voter fraud, increase voter fraud security protection measures is seen as voter suppression. In his 8 years in office, I think the Department of Justice prosecuted 3 instances of voter fraud total. So here's President Trump, and we're already seeing dozens of people charged in Texas and in North Carolina. And I think Homeland Security has been an integral piece of this puzzle, which is being utilized, by the White House. So he is taking it seriously. We don't know exactly what the plans are, but I think even to have the commander-in-chief and the president of the United States telling people we're taking it seriously, we're going to employ the full weight of our security protections to make sure it doesn't happen, I think that serves as an active disincentive for these groups that might otherwise think that it's going to be vulnerable and easy to commit the crime.
What do you think of Democrats that say this is voter suppression? Where they're suppressing fraud, I say, but what do you say? What do you say when Democrats ask about voter suppression, are charged that it's voter suppression?
Yeah, I think it's important that we say, listen, we should be pro-voting, right? I think we should be pro. Everybody that's legally allowed to cast a ballot should be allowed to cast a ballot. Mother Jones just had a long expose in Wisconsin in which they held up 3 people who didn't have ID, couldn't find their ID, and therefore were prevented from being able to cast a ballot. And they're citing that as voter suppression. To me...
Well, you say that kind of incredulously.
Well, because I would say, look, if you go to the wrong polling place, you're not going to be allowed to cast the ballot, right? I mean, you have to follow the law. And if the law says that you need an ID to be able to vote, then I think, that's what the law says. And so now you're like, well, these are people that couldn't cast the ballot. And some people would say, well, it's because they didn't do the thing they were told they needed to do. Well, you didn't have an ID. There's no real evidence to suggest that requiring an ID negatively impacts or suppresses minority turnout. The anecdotal evidence cited by Mother Jones aside, I believe that we've seen, and we talk about this in the book, states like Alabama and Georgia, they've seen increases in minority voting anytime or immediately after they implemented voter ID laws. So I think the anecdotal
I did not
evidence,
know that. Wow. I did not know that.
Yeah, that's correct. No, there's
wait. So let's drill down on that. So you're saying in your research you found that when they instituted voter ID laws, actually more minorities voted?
Correct.
Wow.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Senate race, the special election for Alabama Senate race in 2017 saw, I think, record minority turnout, if I'm not mistaken. So, Yeah, we've seen increases in minority turnout after voter ID laws have been implemented in certain states. So yeah, the idea of voter suppression is sort of tied in with this idea of racism, right? So, and those are the two claims you always get heard that are always sort of lobbed by the left to say, well, anytime that you're trying to implement enhanced security measures for elections, you're really just trying to keep black people from voting. In fact, the former Secretary of State of Missouri, who's now running for mayor of Kansas City, I believe, has said the difference between himself and Chris Kobach, who's running for governor of Kansas and was the co-chair of President Trump's Commission on Election Integrity, when they were at some Secretary of State conference, Jason Kander, the Missouri guy, said, he told Chris Kobach, he said, yeah, the difference is one of us wants black people to vote and one of us doesn't. So oftentimes I actually think it's the left that invokes race in the matter of elections, not the right.
How much more do you think is going to be out here with the voter fraud? It's not going to stop. I mean, do you think there's enough of suppressing, not suppressing, enough of countering and stopping the voter fraud? Yes, suppressing voter fraud. Yes, not suppressing votes, but suppressing fraud. Do you think there's enough out there that it's going to make a big difference in this year's election?
Well, what I know, Greg, and you know this, and since we've spoken, think about the things that we've seen that have occurred nationally, right? We've seen this caravan of people that are coming through Mexico, and so any effort to try to block that is seen as being anti-humanitarian. You've seen the Kavanaugh hearings. We saw incredible protests, and you saw the tactics employed by the Democrats in that process on the Senate Judiciary Committee to try to besmirch his name. You saw the protests employed there. So I think it's clear we've got a motivated base for Democrats that are willing to do any and everything to try to impeach President Trump and to prevent the further implementation of his agenda. So there's no doubt that they got a motivation issue, right? I mean, they're clearly motivated, and I think they believe they're in the moral authority. So I think committing a little bit of voter fraud or capitalizing on the vulnerabilities that exist in the system seems to be well underneath some of the tactics that they've already employed. So I think we're going to see any and every effort be made. I mean, even look at, you see, or Facebook and Google kind of get in the act now, where they're reminding people to vote. And actually, I'm the producer of a film that just came out, The Creepy Line, and it's available on Amazon and on iTunes. And it's basically about how Google and Facebook manipulate us, and they can control and impact the ways in which we think about elections and the impact they might have on U.S. elections. And there's some documentation that's in there that shows how much they may have impacted the 2016 election. So, look, I think we're right to be skeptical. I think we're right to be concerned, and we should support any and all effort to try to make elections as secure as possible.
Do you think, and I'm just going to put this out here, it just seems that this time is over the top. I mean, the mail bombing, it's Trump's fault. You would think he had an office inside the White House putting together these quote-unquote bombs, although they have not named what it was that was supposed to explode. Nobody has asked, what exactly was supposed to explode? What did they use for an explosive? Nobody says anything about it. The synagogue, the awful synagogue mass murder, killing, hate crime, that's also Donald Trump's fault. Everything is Donald Trump's fault. Or they're doing these elaborate plans to smear it, like you said, Kavanaugh. Well, now her lawyer, one of the lawyers, Swetnick, and her lawyer is up for, they're investigating, and they want to have charges for obstruction of Congress and lying to Congress, basically. I mean, so do you think that they know that the voter fraud is going to be diminished, that the election fraud is going to be diminished? So they're going crazy with the caravans, with the over-the-top rhetoric on Donald Trump's to blame for everything, Kavanaugh hearing, all that stuff. Do you think they know the voter fraud is going to be suppressed, and they're going crazy trying to come up with anything because they don't have a message?
Well, what I think is that Donald Trump is clearly an unprecedented force of personality in the White House. For as much as President Obama was seen as this celebrity president, right? Remember, after he was elected, they were selling everything from magazine covers to plates to coins. And, President Obama was good business for not only media outlets, but anybody else that could put his image on something and sell it to someone. But Donald Trump's taken that and taken it to another level where I think he's this dominant cultural force where what he says is obviously immediately picked up by news outlets, but obviously there's quite a few people, half the country almost, are paying close attention to him, and that's good and bad depending upon what part of the country you're in. So what I'd say is I don't think that anyone was prepared for having a president to talk about voter fraud the way that this president has spoken about voter fraud, and the way he's encouraging and kind of emboldening, I think, authorities to not just make sure that everyone that can vote should vote, but also to make sure that people that shouldn't be voting aren't voting. I think that's really the key. For so long, the system was set up, just the bias was towards voting, and rightfully so, right? We are set up as a society where we value and cherish the right to vote. It's one of the most important freedoms we have. But I don't think that there was that backside piece of protection to say, yes, we want everyone that should be voting to vote, but we want to make sure that people that shouldn't be voting aren't voting. But so that's what President Trump is encouraging people to add, that second layer to it. And I'm sure that does impact some of the electoral political math of some of these organizations, and that impacts people in a number of ways.
Do you think that they're freaking out about it? Do you think they're like, oh my gosh, this is not working? We got caught down in Texas. We got caught in Georgia. We're getting caught. People are being prosecuted. This ain't going to work the same as in North Carolina. People are being arrested and charged. This is going to offer a chilling effect, and they know it. Am I wrong?
I think that I can't speak to what the mindset is of these outside groups, but I think certainly it's got to be disconcerting if you're a Texas Democrat and the plan by which your office is sending out these voter registration cards to illegal immigrants and to non-citizens, and they've already marked the box that, yes, you're a citizen. I mean, that's essentially a party to helping commit voter fraud. So you got to be pretty concerned. The other thing the other people I'd be concerned about, by the way, or the other people who should be concerned, are pro-immigration groups. Because what you have to realize about this is, let's say you're a legal resident. Let's say you're somebody who's done it the right way. You waited in line. You got your green card, and you're here, and you're paying taxes, and you're participating in society, and you're waiting to become a naturalized citizen. Well, if you get a voter registration card, and maybe you're confused, or you've been told that, hey, yeah, go vote, and you've got these organized political groups like Acorn and La Raza, pushing you to the polls essentially, and you do vote, you now can never become a naturalized citizen, and in fact, you may be deported. There was just a case in Illinois not too long ago. It was a priest from England, who'd been here for I think 10 to 12 years. Was waiting in line, was about to become a naturalized citizen. But because he voted illegally, I think in 2007, he now has to go back to England and start the process all over again. I mean, that doesn't speak to how vulnerable the system is to exploitation. I don't know what does.
And big penalties. Really, and people don't understand this. This is theft. And this is theft at the local level in the tens of thousands of dollars, in the state level, and probably the millions of dollars in the federal level. It's theft in the billions of dollars with incarcerations, and now president is ordering executive order to say, hey, you can't drop a kid here and that be a citizen. That ain't going to work out. That's not going to be that. You can't do that anymore. I mean, it's really theft, and taxpayers have to pay for the theft that these illegal voters are voting themselves free stuff. I mean, am I wrong? This is really theft.
Well, what I think you're speaking to is the inherent vulnerability in the system, both in terms of our borders, right, and the ways in which people that aren't citizens here can just basically enter the country and assimilate themselves into society, but then also the vulnerability of our electoral system. So, yeah, I think our borders are as secure as our elections, which are to say not very. How many millions of illegal immigrants do we have in this country? I think it's anywhere from 11 to 20 million. And you've got these organized, and this is what we talk about in the book, right? This is why we say, it's the plot, how the left plans to steal the next election. It's not that these immigrants come in and they have this immediate plan to then go out and vote for more benefits for themselves, although that may happen. But what I think it is that more people that are here illegally become essentially vulnerable victims or potential victims by the Acorns and La Razas. They go, they target them, they find them, they sign them up to vote. All these political organizing groups that are paid based on the voter registration. So they go find these guys, they sign them up to vote. Now their names are part of the system that the organized political parties go and they get those guys and they get them to the polls. And you've got a ton of places in these sanctuary cities like San Francisco or Chicago, where you don't even need a driver's license to be able to vote. You can just have a municipal issue ID. Or other places like Minnesota, where you can register to vote on the same day. So it's there's lots of places where it's very easy to commit voter fraud, and there are lots of organized groups that go out and find those people and push them to the polls to be able to cast the ballot, whether they should legally cast the ballot or not. So yeah, I think you should be very concerned, and it's impossible to talk about voter fraud without talking about the vulnerabilities in our immigration system, of which there are many.
Do you think ICE should be at certain polls? Do you think ICE should just have a presence there? That would put the kibosh and create quite a chilling effect, would it not?
Well, unless I think it's telling, right? I'll answer it this way. I think it's telling that in Florida, the guy that's running for governor, who, by the way, it's been documented, his brother committed voter fraud by claiming to vote. Yeah, Andrew Gillum, his brother committed voter fraud by claiming to reside at a place that his brother had sold several years before, and there's sworn affidavits that the brother was living in Chicago and not Florida when he's still casting ballots in the 2016 election. I mean, that just speaks to how easy it is to vote illegally. But so, I mean, I think it's telling that the candidate for the governor of Florida has said in one of his commercials that one of his campaign platforms is to abolish ICE, right? And that's certainly not abnormal. You're seeing people all over the country say that. So, is ICE a popular entity with at least half the country? Certainly not. So would ICE being present, I mean, would the reminder that there are real consequences for illegal immigrants or anybody that shouldn't be voting legally cast a ballot? I would hope so, because I think that's really a problem. And I've spoken to immigration attorneys. A lot of times these immigration groups or these immigrant groups or even convicted felons don't realize they shouldn't be voting just because the laws can vary from state to state on felon right restoration. And immigrants, they're told, well, you can vote in certain local elections, but you can't vote in federal elections. And people just aren't paying that close of attention. They get confused. And again, they become sort of the victims of these political operatives. In South Florida, they're known as boleteros. In Texas, they're known as politicaros. I mean, these are basically people whose job it is to go out and collect as many voters as possible and harvest their votes, whether they're legal or not.
Well, I think some of these guys aren't really victims. They're here illegally. They know they are. They see ICE. They run. They know they're doing something wrong. So leave us with something good. Leave us with something good. I mean, the Democrats don't have a message. I mean, unless we're going to raise your taxes. This is part of their plan. I'm not making this up. We want to abolish ICE. We want to have sanctuary cities. We want to put the rights of criminal aliens above the rights of our citizens. We want to raise your taxes. We want to destroy your rights, especially the Second Amendment. Oh, and also the First, as Hillary Clinton said in 2016 campaign. They want to destroy that too. Big tech is going after people and trying to do everything they can. But wow, it didn't work in 16. Is it going to work in 2018? Is them and their messageless message, the Democrats, which is a message of horrible stuff if they really say what they really want to do, is that going to work in 2018?
Here's what I'll say. If Democrats win and they raise your taxes, we'll have more money to pay for more election security, which includes verification of citizenship at the federal level. I think it's it's going to be really close. Everybody seems to be incredibly divided. I know in Florida, the early returns show that the GOP has a slight edge. But, I know, Greg, you were telling me before we started speaking that you didn't believe the polls in 2016. And
I said that many times.
And you're proven to be correct. There doesn't seem to be there seemed to be less of an embrace of an agenda by the left and more of a rejection of the current status quo and specifically the current president. So
that's clearly what it is. That's not even less of. It's clearly they don't have an agenda other than all the stuff: raise your taxes, do away with ICE, make you a second-class citizen in your own country, secondary to illegal aliens. Clearly, that's what they want to do. I mean, they want to replace the electorate with people that'll vote for their crazy, stupid stuff.
Well, I think the good news is, here's the best news I can leave you with, Greg, is that I think people are, and we've seen a number of stories pop up about voter fraud being identified and prosecuted. So because of President Trump, I think because of people like you, hopefully because of people that have been reading this book and people that work and volunteer as security personnel at election centers all over the country, I think elections are going to, there's an effort to try to make them as secure as possible, given the inherent vulnerabilities. So let's just hope that a week from today, that if there is illegal voting, it gets caught, and that the perpetrators are prosecuted, and that as many true and honest votes count as much as possible.
One last thing about the polls. I think the polls, at first I thought they were just kind of a psyop to say, don't bother going. I mean, at one point, even the ABC poll was disbelieved by one of their main anchors because Hillary Clinton was up 12 points. And I thought, why would they be that far off? They have to be intentionally, well, because they wanted it to match the fraud. And then you have Project Veritas with Bob Kramer, who got caught in Project on camera. So we got to win this. We're going to make it, and the DNC is paying for it. And he was at the White House 4 dozen times.
Absolutely, and you got Tom Perez, who's the head of the DNC, and his organization, Casa de Maryland, has been incentivizing and encouraging non-citizen voting for decades. So yeah, I mean, you've clearly got to push by the Democrats to try to get as many people to vote as possible, regardless of whether they should be. And yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what they're up against.
I think the polls reflect that we're going to cheat this much, so the polls have to reflect it. Would you agree with that?
I have to study the polls. I know that just to the point, right? There's one poll in Florida for governor that shows Andrew Gillum up 12. There's another poll that shows Ron DeSantis up 1. So, I mean, their spread is so crazy on some of these polls. Anybody that wants to speculate as to how they come up with numbers is smarter than me, because I got no idea.
And the final thing, though, you think that there's a heightened awareness about voter fraud. You think that?
Yeah, don't you? I mean, how else do you explain? Either there's a heightened awareness of it, or the volume of it has gotten so much, and people become so egregious with it that it's just easier to catch people doing it. But here's what I'll tell you, and I was talking to a lawyer who's been working a sheriff's race in Florida from 2016, and it came very close, and it was being settled by about 30 votes. And then they identified, actually, I think over 40 votes that were cast by felons.
Oh.
Actually, no, the margin was 16 votes, and they found over 30 votes that had been cast by potential felons. And this has gone through court rulings for now almost 2 years. And a judge actually ruled that, well, any votes that get cast by illegal people on election day, even if we figured it out now, it's not enough to overturn the election, because we'd have to give them their due process. We'd have to let them know that we identified them as potential illegal voters, and then they'd have 30 days to respond. And, by statute, we have to prosecute this election and secure it. So it's pretty unreal that you had a court case in Florida in which they said, well, any illegal voting that did occur, it's less important than us by law having to certify this election. So, I mean, that just speaks to how vulnerable it is. And that's why it's so important to catch on the front end. So I'm glad that there does seem to be this heightened level of awareness, and that's what's happening now.
Fantastic. That's good news. Okay, here we have it. It's the book. It's called Fraud. I'll just get a full screen here. Fraud, How the Left Intends to Steal the Next Election. And maybe we should just say this interview is how the how the right and how we the people intend to stop them from the stealing, huh?
Let's hope so.
Eric Eggers, thank you very much. I hope soon to be a bestseller. Let's just go ahead and throw it on there. Soon to be a bestseller of the book Fraud. There'll be links for this and after the interview section. Eric Eggers, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Greg, you're the best. Thank you.